I'd like to welcome you today to our 3:30 class, Are You Related to Royalty by James Tanner. And we'd like to thank him for all of the things he does to prepare for these classes, all of the time that he takes, and for his expertise. We appreciate him, his faithfulness, and always being there.
Okay, so this seems to be a very common topic, as are you related to royalty? I don't know if you'll be disappointed or justified, or however you want to do that you react to what I have to say today, but it's pretty cut and dried. There's not a lot of wiggle room there to say one way or the other, but we're just going to go ahead and dive into how it works and why it does and why it doesn't. The first thing we need to know when you get talking about royalty is sometimes you're talking about royalty and sometimes you're not. And the first thing is the definition. A royal person is a king, queen, emperor, or a member of their family. Okay, so it's not all these thousands of nobility people, because the nobility is a group of people belonging to the noble class in a country, especially those with a hereditary or honorary title and not usually related to the king by blood. So if you're a blood relation with the king, then you're considered to be a royal family. And if you're simply got some aspirations of being famous because somebody in your family was nobility, that would be like dukes and all of the different people, people different, all those different titles. There's just a whole listing of different titles out there for different people in the different countries in Europe. But those people are not royalty. They are simply nobility. And somebody, for instance, who is a great rock and roll singer can be knighted by the king, and they then become technically nobility. But so that's just the way that goes. Now, really, and this is a serious suggestion. I, obviously have no way of requiring people do things, but I would seriously suggest that before you spend a long time trying to learn about whether you have a royal ancestor and whether or not you're, all this kind of stuff that you might think, you just should or might want to read about the history of genealogy. And there's a really good book. It's Francois Ville, and he has written a book called Family Trees: A History of Genealogy in America. And I've given you the link to the book. It's also available in digital format. You're going to spend a lot of time doing research going back to start out with, to even get to the point where you could even begin to claim that you were descendants of royalty. And when you get to that point, you'll have a little bit more of a confusing time with all of the different things you may find that say yes and no and all that. And so if you read this book, which gives you an outline of some of the things that happened in the past, then that will help you to evaluate a lot of the information you're getting as you go back and try and establish that kind of connection. Historically, many royal ancestral lines were fabricated to show royal descent of the monarch. Now, this is reality. This is historical reality. When someone, by whatever means, became king or queen of the country, they immediately wanted to justify their position, because in England there was a sort of belief in the divine right of kings and queens. And so because of that, they would pay somebody to give them a genealogy. And of course, if you wanted to stay working for the king, you'd tell him that he was related by such and such to all the way back to some famous person or to whoever in that particular country they felt it was important to do that. So it's just well known. It's just a standard idea when you start getting into various different lines of royal descent, that there is controversy and there are a number of them which are discredited, and there are a number of them that may or may not be more accepted. This is kind of an example of how that process went in the history, and this is basically mentioned in the book that I recommended on the history of genealogy. But it's also an indication that there's this information out there. If you start looking for it, you'll find out that there's a lot of problems with genealogy. This guy, Gustave Agneau, lived until 1942, and he was a professional genealogist and a great salesman. And he prepared hundreds of, there's not even any real knowledge of how many fake genealogies he created. But he would just simply make people happy because he told them they were related to Marie Antoinette or they were married to some famous king or whatever. And he made a bit of money, and sometimes his first name is Gustave and sometimes it's with an E. But this is one of the main things. Now, what's the important thing to know about what happened with Agneau? Agneau, basically, if you go on Family Search Family Tree or any one of the other family trees out there online, there is a fairly substantial chance, if you're getting back into the 1600s, that you're picking up names that this guy made up. So you're really going to have to be extremely careful if you start back in time. And that's just one of the examples. And he worked for people in New York and New England. And as I just said, many of these fake pedigrees are still being repeated online family trees. So you're just copying this guy who made a few, good money selling off false information. In another case, this is something that here in the western part of the United States and in a lot of places around the United States, this thing was sold by different publishing companies. And this is a list of names of people, from current, at the time this was done, it was back in the 1920s. It was the people currently there. Some very famous people like presidents and whatever in 1920s were listed here. And then their supposed ancestry all the way back to Adam was given on this folding chart that was sold. And here in Utah, this was sold until just a few years ago. You could go down to some of the local bookstores here and buy a copy of this chart, which of course gave you if you tied into anybody on the bottom line of this, or even came to be a relative, you had your automatic listing of everybody back. Pure fabrication, absolutely no basis in fact, no actual research. In fact, diligent research has never found or discovered who Albert F. Schmuel was. We don't know who he was, and we don't know where he lived or whatever, or if the name was made up. So it's not possible. That's possible, but this is something that's very common. And if you click back far enough on some of your lines on Family Search Family Tree, you may very well run into one that seems to go back and back and back and end up at Adam. And that's probably a very high percentage of the time actually just a copy of this particular thing that was this document, whatever, that was fabricated and sold for many years around. And I have people still nobody recently has done this, but I've had people in the past pull this out and say, I have this all the way back. Okay, well, fine. So I can't find any references to Albert F. Schmuel, and no one else has either. And there are absolutely no sources attached to this at all. We don't know where or how he got the information or what he thought, why he thought it was somehow valid. So to show you that information that was created by this guy then becomes sort of the snowball effect of picking up more information from other people, whether it was validly researched or not validly researched, until it kind of creates a an idea that here's this body of information that shows that we're related to all these kings and queens and all these people all the way back to Adam. And this is a current website. And basically, this is the quote from it. And I'm not going to read the whole quote, but if you go down through here, you'll see that this thing was based on Albert Schmuel's, and the part of it taking it back to the creation of Adam back in 4000 BC was directly from him. So this is how this all kinds of things. And when you launch yourself off into any research before 1600 into 1500s, and it just goes up exponentially steep curve up of information that's harder and harder to verify. And so that's the caution that you have as you undertake this. And all I can say is that many of the online pedigrees before 1500 have been copied from sources just like that, like this pedigree chart and others that have no sources, have no way to verify whether the information is correct. So now the question that arises, of course, is there correct information? Is there some valid genealogically supportable way to create a pedigree that goes back to one of the people in the royal line? Well, that's kind of what we're going to talk about. But let me emphasize this, that genealogy is based on research. If I put in a date, then that date is based either on a source directly that gives me the date directly, or is a way to calculate that date. So what do I mean by that? For example, if I have a US Census record and it says that the person is 46 years old and it's an 1880 census, I can subtract 46 from 1880 and have the date, an approximate year of birth. Now that's valid. And you can say about ABOUT or ABT, depending on the program you're using, and put in that date. That helps you find the person because it narrows down the possibilities. But back in your mind, you may be thinking, or you should be thinking, well, what if this guy lied about his age? Or what if the person who gave the information in the census record had no idea how old he was really and just guessed? Well, all that happens, and subsequent research about this individual may find out that that date was not an accurate date. Well, if you get one inaccurate date, and because of that, you get one inaccurate person, it doesn't matter how far back in your line you go, because that line is no longer valid, and you just have gone off into fantasy land. So basis, if you're going to do that, then you need to be more careful. The rule is simple: no sources, no connection. So unless you have a verifiable, repeatable, in other words, somebody else could come in and look and find it, source that establishes a parent-child relationship in each generation, you really don't have any connection there. And you can go clear back to Adam if you want to do that, because you can copy all that stuff. But the minute you start copying something and not verifying it, if you go into a book and it says this person was a son of this person, was the son of this person, or the mother was this person, and then the father was this person, and so forth, and it has no sources, and it doesn't tell you how in the world where that information came from, you're at the end, you're stuck, you're stopped. There's no place further to go. And so the minute you start copying information, like off of one of these sheets, like the one that was being sold, that basically is no longer genealogical research. That's just your wanting to be so related to somebody that you're willing to copy down this not supportable or unsupportable amount of information just to establish that for whatever reason that you have personally. So, but and in addition to that, it's what, despite what you might think, and I guess the reason why I would say things like this is is not only, it makes some people mad, but it makes other people say, oh, really? Oh, I wish I'd known that before I spent 20 years doing this. There's nothing special about researching for royal noble ancestors. Research is research. If I keep going back on all my lines, I know exactly where every line ends, where I no longer have any sources showing who the parents are of this last person in that line. And I've been doing this for more than 40 years, and I have never connected a line to anyone that even vaguely looked like royalty or nobility in Europe. So, and that's on all these variations outlines going out into the early 18 and 17 and 16 and in some cases 1500s. But that may be a disappointment to some, but to me, it's just simply a basic thing. I know, and I could probably stay with virtually 100%, and I'll explain why, 100% assurity that if I continued enough of those lines back, that I would inevitably 100% find some kind of a royal ancestor, period. That's just the way it's going to be because of a very simple thing. Now, important to know, this is royalty. This isn't nobility. Now, you could be related to nobility and nobody'd even know because maybe they didn't even know this guy was a noble, and you'd have to discover that by some historical research. But let's suppose that it is somebody who's verifiably noble, whatever. But there's thousands and thousands and thousands of those people. So being related to that group of people is not necessarily even particularly difficult. But if you are related to royalty, I mean real European royalty, if you're part of the royal family, you highly percentage of time, you would already know that. And my comment that I've made after doing that kind of researching that particular issue about whether or not you can unknowingly be part of the royal family is that you probably would already know it, and you would probably be driving some exotic car and have some castle that you could spend your summers in or winters or wherever you wanted to go. So it's not something that would be rumored in your family. And in my own family, I can go back just a couple of generations and find a book about one of my ancestors that I won't go into in detail, but basically that she was supposed to be the illegitimate daughter of basically one of the English kings and queens. And the reason why they said that was because she had a remarkable resemblance to the queen. I've looked at both and I don't think I see any resemblance at all, but that was their family tradition. And it wasn't until not long time after that book was written and quite a long time after that it became entrenched in the family tradition that we showed that she was not even closely related to anybody that could be even considered to be nobility, much less royalty. And we have her generations back without any connections at all. So that's another problem. That's the issue of the family tradition. Okay, but here's the key. This is the big thing. Recent DNA testing confirms that every person, every last European-born person with European ancestry, even if you just have one line that's in Europe, basically all of them are related. Everybody is related. And so everybody is related to royalty. That's why I'm saying it's not really that great a thing to prove you're going back to royalty, because we know now, because of all the DNA testing that has been done, that everybody in Europe is related, basically. And so how many generations back? Well, that may give you some more incentive to go back on your lines, but I've got a ancestral line that comes up in more than one DNA test that I have ancestors in Italy. I have never, in any of my years and years of research, come across anyone that I could arguably say came from or was originated in Italy. So maybe some Roman conqueror back years and years ago who was in Northern Europe or whatever, and maybe I'm related to that person, and that's why they think I'm from Italy. But basically, this is the most current status. In fact, if you go back any more thousands of years, a few more thousands of years, everyone on the face of the earth is related. So there's so little difference in people's genealogical makeup that really there aren't that many, there's not very much uniqueness about each individual in the sense of a large pool of genealogical data from DNA testing. So, but the trick is finding reliable genealogical sources to support the DNA findings. So in other words, if you say, well, I'm related to Henry VIII, and so you're going to go try to prove you're related to Henry VIII. Well, you might be related to some king over in Bavaria or down in Spain or someplace, but that never works in genealogy. You don't necessarily a priori, it says the term in Latin for legal purposes. You don't from the beginning make an assumption and try to prove the assumption. You simply let the facts stand, and then whatever it is, it is. You don't sit there and then argue with the facts, which is what some people do. However, this is the reason why we're all related, because of what's called pedigree collapse, that people marry their cousins. Okay. And what I'm finding as I go back on my lines, and I get back into the early 1800s and into the 1700s and whatever, if you're familiar a little bit with Family Search, there's a way to click on that and in other programs to show how you're related to this person. So you click on that on your person that you're researching, and then it shows you a pedigree list of all the people back to where you have your common ancestor, either a direct line ancestor or through descendancy or whatever. So now you have a way of knowing how you're related to anybody you're researching on the family tree. And so you go click, 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 and use your back ways, and you click, and all of a sudden it says you're not related to any of these people. Well, the problem that says is not, that doesn't really mean you're not related. All that means is that there's no connection that shows in through research on the family tree. So if you were to go back further, you may very well find out that you are related to that line. And so that's sort of what happens. And as I'm doing research now, as I move back further and further on different lines, it's very common for me to find the husband of a descendancy person, a person who's a cousin of mine, and then I'll find their spouse, and then I'll look to see if I'm related to the spouse, and it will say, no, I'm not related. I'm only related through the fact that he or she married my cousin. And then I'll find that person's parents, and I'll find out I am related because I'm related to his parents or her parents. And that's becoming just tremendously common as the family tree and as other online resources keep growing and getting more and more and more information, because more and more people are being able to establish these relationships. But the given fact is that according to DNA, all of the current royal families in Europe are related. So if you're related to one of them, you're related to the whole bunch. And so I guess from my standpoint, and having spent so much time doing genealogy, I personally questioned the utility of me spending time trying to even establish that. Why would I care if I knew that everybody was related and that it was inevitable if I followed enough lines back that I would find a royal connection? And that isn't, to me, enough of an incentive to go back. But if it is for you, that's great. I'm not faulting anybody for taking that kind of interest. We start researching, but we start researching in any event systematically, meaning person by person. What I see a lot of times is people say, well, our family tradition said they came from here. Okay, so here we are, and we'll start from here. Well, if you jump back, if you skip over any generation, even one generation, then you're basically launching yourself, as I said earlier, out into fantasy land, because that basically does not give you that anchor, that the foundation, or whatever you want to call it, that takes you down to someone who you know absolutely you're related to, not just because somebody told you were, because you took a DNA test and they showed that you were. Okay, so that's a little bit more. So here's where you have to be careful and not all of a sudden decide to copy the work of others on a family tree. There is no without any sources, there is no way in the world that these people are going to be valid. So here we have Thomas Godfrey in 1405 and his marriage in 1420 and to Joanne Godfrey Tamworth. That raises an issue already, because did she have the same surname as Thomas? Was she a relative of Thomas? And then where did she come from? Or, whatever. Anyway, but she's supposed to be a Tamworth. So then we go out here and look to see about Sir Nicholas. Well, here we are. Sir Nicholas was born about, and he's deceased, obviously, and no sources. And he has a memory. This obviously proves who he is, because this memory, and the memory that he has just happens to be a coat of arms. So, of course, here he is. He's a Sir Nicholas, and he has a coat of arms. There's just one problem. This particular coat of arms is not his coat of arms. It's Lincolnshire City. It's just some coat of arms randomly picked up out of England that basically was somehow assigned to this person. Somebody back there needed a coat of arms. They thought this one looked pretty cool, so they just said, oh, I'll just use this. Okay, so that gets us into the issue of coats of arms. There's a heraldry society in England that is an official government-sponsored or affiliated society, and basically they decide who has a herald, a coat of arms, and who does not. And it doesn't have anything to do particularly with what you think or what your aspirations are. It just means that you basically can do it. But another thing that's really interesting is that you can spend a few bucks, and any number of companies online will provide you with a coat of arms. So if you've ever wanted a coat of arms, just get online, click, pay a few bucks, and you'll have a coat of arms. Looks pretty neat sometimes. Okay, so here, in fact, here's some pricing to give you an eye. You can get a custom shield for this, and you get a Royal Coat of Arms, or you can get a British Royal Coat of Arms, or your own individual coat of arms. So basically, that's where all that comes from. And this is the interesting thing, except for a few individual exceptions from some parts of Eastern Europe, there is no such thing as a family coat of arms for a particular surname, despite the claims and implications of some companies to the contrary. So if your name's Tanner, like my name is Tanner, I can go out and get a Tanner coat of arms, but there is no such thing. It's simply somebody has figured out a way to get 20 or 30 bucks or 100 more, or 200, 300 bucks or whatever out of me, because I would like to have a coat of arms, and I think that's cool. Okay. So once again, and I'm going to repeat this over and over, because this is kind of what creates the breaking point in all of this, and that is you can only move back a generation with a valid contemporary historical record showing a parent-child relationship. And so the fastest and easiest way for me to review someone's pedigree if they say, well, I need help and where should I start, is I just start with them and I go back and see whether or not there's a parent-child relationship. And I can, and 100% of the time, if I just randomly pick a line to follow, I will, on a family search family tree, for example, I will run into the situation where names have been added on back into the past, for which there are no sources that indicate that there was a parent-child relationship. So that's the end of the line. It doesn't really matter how many names have been added previously by other people, because they didn't bother to tell us where the information came from. Okay, so in the United States, you can connect to what's called a gateway ancestor, someone who already has approved pedigree to royalty. There are books that talk about gateway ancestors. That's the magic term. And they start with the Mayflower people, and they go back and they come forward listing all the people out of mostly the Eastern Seaboard and primarily from New England, but there are other books that cover all of the early settlers that they've been able to investigate. And it might surprise some people to find out that 40% of the people, or anywhere between 40 to 80%, depending on which source you look at, of the people who early people who came to the United States, to America, were indentured servants or enslaved people. And so none of those people had any connections enough to keep from getting shipped across the Atlantic as either a criminal or a debtor or something, or some other, or just an undesirable person that they just wanted to get rid of. So they shipped them across the country and sold them off as indentured servants. And the number of those is tremendously high, the percentage of people that are in that category. And so you're going to have to, if you get to that point, which I do very, very, very frequently get to the point that I have the immigrant from Europe, but I have absolutely no idea, no records that show where he came or when he came or whatever, or she. And that is basically because of that fact. So a gateway ancestor is a person or on your genealogical tree who descends from royalty. Most often they're from the 17th century colonial America and connect to the aristocracy of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, France, and other European countries. So your goal, if you're going to do from the United States, if you're going to try to find a royal ancestor, is to connect with a believable and sustainable and verifiable pedigree back to one of these gateway people, and then you're home free. All that work's already been done. There's no reason for you to dig into old documents or try to do whatever you want to do, but you can't. That's the simplest way to get past that point. So this is it. Here's this database on ancestry, ancestral roots of certain American colonists who came to America before 1700. So this will help you tell you who they were and whatever. This is on ancestry. There's similar kinds of things on family search. The genealogy section, if you go in there, you'll find a section called into what's called genealogy. And then you go into genealogies and you find that there's an area that talks about different types of genealogies. And so you can get in there and find all the royal families of Europe and all the nobles and everybody. All of those people have all been documented, and those that are believable, it's there. And those that have only a little bit of information are also noted as that. So there's not a lot of let's say, work that hasn't already been done to provide the database. All you have to do, if you really want to try to do this, is to connect to the existing information that is already fairly readily available. But of course, you have to have a family line back to the 1600s before you can basically get into this particular area. Here's a website, And you can go to Gateway Ancestors, and it's basically will tell you whether any of these people listing here in the names from New England, and this mostly New England in this case, Virginia, and there is also in there, that basically tells you all of the people that that could be related to you, and that would be along those lines. And if you start and connect to any of these people with a good, verifiable research, then you are Bink Magna Carta Barons, Crusaders, Templar Knights, your whatever, or any one of the other nobility or royal lines. So perhaps you didn't think it was quite that simple, but the answer is that you really don't have to think about this idea of going in and digging and in these old records and learning Latin and all that kind of stuff. It's all been done. It's all been done over and over and over again. And the reason that it's all been done, and it seems so simple that that you could do it. It's not really simple, by the way, to get back to the 1700s on a line. It takes a lot of work, but it just comes from the fact that everybody's related to royalty. When you get right down to it, every last person. What does that mean? Okay, so now I know you're related to royalty. So what about all these charts that I talked about that are just fabricated? Well, that was where I wanted you to understand the history, a little bit of the background of this, that you don't go copy and copy. You go to the actual sources of information that will take you back to the 1600s. And then you do additional research to match up with one of these accepted, verified lists of people who do descend from royalty. That's all you have to do in that regard. If you want to copy all that out into your family tree, be my guest, but please don't do it in Family Search. It doesn't help anybody to have all that copied information into the tree. It's already there, and it's already interested. If for those who might be listening who are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, all the work's been done for all those people long ago, clear back maybe as far as 70 or 80 or close to 100 years they've been working on those, and there just isn't any of it. It would take a tremendous amount of research, and I have seen it done, to come up with any new information about any of these people in Europe, any of the royalty or nobility in Europe. It's like trying to find information about the Mayflower people that hasn't been already published in the Mayflower Society silver books. It just is not going to happen to someone unless you happen to be sitting in England in some old librarian doing research. So here's another source. This is the Family Search Research Wiki, and they will give you some ideas of all the different England medieval records and the years that they cover. So these are the actual records that you can use to go back into to that medieval period of time, dating back to the original Doomsday Book of 1086. This is a website called probably Passe, and it's, or maybe Pace, but I'm sure it's Passe, is a prosopography of Anglo-Saxon England. And what that is a cultural, social database showing relationships between all the different people and who they were and where they lived and what they did. Here's another one. It's called Medieval Lands, and it's basically tells the same kinds of things. So these are huge databases that have all these thousands and hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people, and shows how they're related to each other and who they are and what they've done. And that people have spent their lives putting all this stuff together, and it's there. If you go to the right sources, if you understand that you're looking at information and understand what kind of information you're looking for. It's not something that your grandmother pulled out and said, oh, well, here's a list back to Adam. No, you have basically, these are the people that have done the verification on this. And this is a narrative biographical genealogies of all the major noble families that ruled Europe between the 5th and 15th century. And they verify it against primary source material, and they quote relevant extracts in the original language, so you can verify it. So here's the definition. It's a description of a person's social and family connections, career, etc., or a collection of such descriptions. So this is what you'll kind of thing you'll get back into as you go and do research back to that particular time in Europe. These records are available. They're the problem in my case and in my personal research experience is that getting back to this time period when this is all going to be valid and useful, the 15th centuries, for example, I have to go through all of the people who are back and forth and being changed, and nobody seems to agree. And so that makes it a sort of a very difficult task to maintain this kind of connections. And by the way, there are no connections at all to royalty for anybody that was on the Mayflower. This is another one. There's an endless number of these, and here's the link to it. This is called Noble, Princely, Royal, and Imperial Titles, and it will tell you what all those names mean. The dukes and the margraves and the counts and all of those different people, marquises and the viscounts and the baronets. Basically, it defines all those and gives you an example of how the people would have those. And that's getting into that mass of people that are in the nobility. Plus, there are thousands, and that's probably an understatement, of books about royal and noble families. And here's the first one in this particular worldcat.org search is, it says there's 1,261 results for royal and noble families. With that search. If you said royal families, you'd get a different number and whatever. So varying the search, you'll get more books. But so here's all these books for various specific kings and for medieval England, for royal and noble ancestry, Americans of royal and noble ancestry, people that have had their genealogy passed back to those. And basically, as you go through this, you'll find out that, as I said very earlier, if you're royal in a royal family, then you probably already know you're in a royal family. But if you don't, then it doesn't take a tremendous amount. Let's say it does. It takes a significant amount of effort to have a valid pedigree back to any of these people. But once you're there, then you can evaluate and see what kinds of records are out there. I'm not saying any of these books are really good or useful or helpful or anything, because I am not going to look at 1,200 books to try and figure that out. So that's another issue, and that would be to see whether they actually connect to some kind of a verifiable, meaning a source that you can actually go out and look at, and it says what it's being quoted as saying. So anytime that I see a line online on an online pedigree, or someone brings me a pedigree, they do. Recently, that used to be very common that people would be bringing in paper records to me, but recently it's becoming quite uncommon. A few people still do, but most of the people that I deal with, almost all now, have some kind of an online tree that you can look at. And when those lines purport to extend beyond 1550, I just don't find adequate sources for them. And so that isn't to say that given the information that I have shown today, that there aren't valid sources out there, but people just don't seem to understand or realize that when you copy something down from one of those card things, that finding a verifiable way to support that is going to be just a fruitful, because the stuff was made up originally, so you can't really ever find the actual sources for it. So that's just kind of where you are. If you do decide to do this, let's suppose that you're saying, well, I don't, notwithstanding what he has to say, what I have to say, that you are probably going to think, well, I would really like to know that. That's something I would just love to know. My answer is that's fine, because this is the things that you'll face if you make that decision. First of all, understand that languages change over time. So as you go back to the 1500s, everything you know about English is all of a sudden going to be superfluous, because you're not going to be reading English. You're going to be beginning to read Middle English, and then you'll get back to Old English, and then you'll get back to Anglo-Saxon and other languages that underlie English. So language is always going to be a challenge. And then you're going to get a lot of unfamiliar terminology, not to mention the difficulty in reading the handwriting, but you will find a lot of things that you'll need to start to learn. And the handwriting is going to become substantially a major issue, especially if you get back into before 1500, because the handwriting systems were very difficult to read, and without a lot of experience. And then you're going to run into a lot of Latin terms, because as you go back, particularly anything that has to do with legal or religious records, will end up being in Latin eventually, far enough back in time, or at least the majority in Latin, or very, very little in any local language. And whatever language you're looking at, especially if it's derived from Latin, like Romance languages, if you're searching in French or Italian or Spanish or whatever, the whole language begins to look like Latin, because that's what they are. They're all Latin determined languages, so descended languages. Okay, so my counsel, I guess, to everyone out there is, don't get lost on the way. Don't get so far into the idea that your family has this coat of arms, and so therefore you need to go out and find all these royal relatives and whatever, that you get lost from doing some very meaningful and research in areas of people that would be a lot more, to you, probably meaningful, in the sense that you can relate to these people and their difficulties and their problems. And instead of just trying to find names that connect all the way back to a king, how about spending your same time trying to find out about your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your cousins or someone that maybe you don't know anything about, and spend some time learning and getting a basic foundation for understanding the lives and the difficulties and the challenges of all these people that came before you. That would be a lot more productive and a lot more meaningful to you and your family and your children and grandchildren or your relatives than it would be to find out that you're related to some king or queen. And I guess the summary that I would put in is, number one is, yes, it's doable. It is possible. And yes, the royalty and the nobility had children, and there's a 100% chance that at some point in time you would be able to establish at least one of your lines somehow. There are those thousands of lines that you've got by the time you go back enough generations. Would have been a noble or a royal line. So that's the answer is, yeah, it's there. And I guess my response to that is kind of shrugging my shoulders and saying, yeah, but why would I do that? Why would I spend my time doing that? I'm more now, for instance, interested in doing the descendants because I'm finding some remarkable things about the descendants of the people that I'm related to. And I think that that is far, far for me more interesting than finding out that I'm related to some king that lived in Europe many years ago. If that helps you, do it. But don't get lost. Always work to get a good foundation in history, geography, languages, and research methodology. Copying is not research. Thank you.